Hello, welcome to this
Hello.
talk. I am here today with Joe G, who is going to be talking about Mercury's role as the binary defying planet, which I am so happy that you have agreed to do and that you're enthusiastic about doing.
Of course.
And before we start, I just want to read your bio so we hear a little about you. So Joe is a jack of all trades, traditional astrologer, ceremonial magician, and multimedia artist. Joe's insatiable curiosity drives them to approach astrology as a multidisciplinary practice as they combine all of their skills in one cohesive practice. Throughout their work with astrology, Joe aims to contribute creative new ways to embrace and work with fate while inspiring others to do the same.
Nice.
And I just say before we start that, one of the my goals in holding this symposium is, of course, to blend the gender binary, and talk about traditional binary ways we have worked with archetypes of various genders, but then also to hold this space with the reality that gender is a whole construct. And so the day that your talk is on is called the wholeness of gender. And
Right.
so that's a big part of I'm assuming what we're going to be talking about. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm super excited to hear and listen and be here with you.
Sweet. Yeah,
So
I'm also super stoked to be here, especially talking about Mercury, my favorite planet.
mhm.
No wonder I have it right by my ascendant. That's not the only reason why Mercury is my favorite planet.
And
But yeah, we will be talking about gender a whole lot. But I think that a good place to start too is just talking about Mercury and why would Mercury even be related to gender in the first place? Because you talked about it as you were introducing about this whole idea how throughout time we've talked about gender in this such a binary way, and it's so interesting when looking back into the history of astrology, and especially because I primarily study Hellenistic astrology and Renaissance astrology. Um, Mercury's always been the planet that is gender defying. And yet, when you go back to read all the text, they're always using he as a pronoun. And that's the thing that really gets me to think about um, language and the broad spectrum of things and the power that it has, but also just why is it that we've never came up with a word for 2,000 years? Because Hellenistic astrology is 2,000 years old. How come we never came up with a gender for Mercury specifically or a word for it? And now we're getting into the modern age where we're trying to implement the singular they as more of a normal thing. And I think that looking into the history of Mercury as a planet and how we understand it can really change how we approach the singular they and how we can be able to accept it without the pushback. Because I think more often than not, especially me as a person who identifies with he and they pronouns, whenever I bring the they pronoun, it's always like, oh, it doesn't feel very grammatically correct. It's hard to say, and it just feels like we need to come up with a completely new name for it. But I don't think that needs to be the case. But yeah, I guess that's the intro to everything that we're going to be talking about today. Do you have any questions so far?
no, I was just going to throw in that I don't know if you know that the friend of a friend of yours, Ada, who we mentioned a minute
Mhm.
ago before we got on camera, her talk is actually super excited. It's going to be about Venus and the moon in the ancient some ancient approaches which I didn't know about, which think of them as masculine, right? So it's like I think it's
Right.
super cool. Um, all of this. I mean, just that we can mix. our associations with all of these archetypes, not just Mercury, in so many different ways. And so
Right.
yeah.
And that's certainly part of like the whole, and this is a thing that I always try to step away from when talking about gender, is the idea of like gender as a construct or as a societal construct, because truly everything is a societal construct.
Yeah.
So I try to kind of not use that, but it is very true that all of these things, all of these devices that we use to talk about the planets, especially, they're constructed. It's not like Venus is a woman. Venus is so much more bigger than any other thing can ever be. It's a That's what an archetype is. It's something that's ineffable and cannot be um, totally measured. And Mercury just the same. And I think Mercury even to a greater degree, because even in its symbolism, Mercury fails to really fit within any spectrum or within any sort of like malefic, benefic, diurnal, nocturnal. Mercury is always just, I'm Mercury and this is who I am. um, but one of the things that I also, just to keep going on this idea of Mercury as not just defying gender, but defying all sorts of spectrums as a whole, is even going back to Ptolemy and how Ptolemy describes Mercury as it's the drying and humidifying planet. And even looking at physically Mercury, it always has one side faced to the sun and the other side faced to the rest of the universe. So one side is always cold, one side is always warm. So Mercury is always in that numinous space where both things can be true. And I think Mercury serves as an invitation for us to use our minds, because Mercury as the planet of thought and mind, to break away from the mold of physical and carnal reality. Because sometimes we can be so attached to how things look and feel like in a very tangible way, which is much more lunar, I would say. But Mercury opens up the space to be like, hey, there is more than just what you can touch, and there is more than just what you can feel even. There are things that are purely conceptual, and that doesn't make them any less real, but they're, yeah, I guess that is the point that I was kind of going with. Yeah, did you have any questions? I saw that you were going to say something real quick, but I kept talking and I didn't want to interrupt.
No, I'm just, the next question on my mind is probably where you're about to go, which is, I'd love to hear you basically define Mercury, like what is Mercury, and because a lot of people listening to this aren't astrologers and don't know astrology and
Right.
don't know the archetypes, and if you want to just,
Yeah, of course. So just talking about the whole thing with the moon and Mercury. There's something called the Chaldean order, and it basically puts the order of the planets both in how we perceive them. Like if we see if we were to see all the planets in the sky at one time, by using the Chaldean order, we could put them in order to which one looks the closest. And which one looks the closest also means which ones moves the fastest. So the Chaldean order is used in all sorts of spaces. Tarot also uses it. Kabbalah also uses it, and it's just one of those. It's one of the parts of the tradition that's kind of hard to really spot where it comes from, and it's always been in all sorts of different places. The reason why I bring this is that to get to Mercury, Mercury is the second sphere after the Earth. So we have the Earth as the very first, or as the kingdom, and then you have the moon, which is obviously the closest. It's both physically closest, but it's the one that looks the closest as well. And then we come to Mercury. And whenever we talk about the moon, the keywords that come up are usually about family and your feelings and emotions, and that sense of belonging to the group or the mundane world and the mundane sphere and the everyday, the things that just like fit in place and are mundane and always just stay the same, but they're always fluctuating. The moon and the sun have that similar relationship, where the sun stands for things that are completely fixed and unchanging, but the moon is fixed and unchanging in a movable way. It's supposed to always move. Now Mercury, on the other hand, is that thing that breaks away from the mold of family and of the ordinary and the things that just happen on the day to day, because the next step up into that whole scale, and then you keep going up and you go through Venus, think Sun after Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then you get to all the other ones. But the reason why I'm saying this is that I think one of the things that prevents us oftentimes from breaking from the binary mold is the moon. Because one of the things, and the moon, not in literal moon, but just the archetype of the moon. It's that thing that we're always used to that being the routine, or always used to that being always the same and never changing, that whenever something mercurial comes around that breaks the mold of what's supposed to be not just right or wrong, but what's supposed to be male or female, and what's supposed to be day or night, that's when things can really get unstable to a point where everyone is just trying to get back together and put things back into place and categorize all these things. And the funny thing about that is that it continues the trend of contradictions with Mercury, because to sort things out and to categorize them is also a very mercurial thing. So Mercury is both the planet that has no categories, but it's the one supposed to categorize everything else. And as I was preparing for this, that thought really just stuck with me for a really long time, because I think that by looking at what is out of the ordinary, we can really get a sense of what ordinary things really are. And it can open us, it can open the space, and it can open the mind, which is the Mercury word that we're looking for here, to change what is ordinary. And not even, I guess, not even to change is not the word, it's just to see that what's not ordinary is part of the ordinary the whole time. Like, we need that disruption to have cohesion. And it's always goes back to that whole thing, the one and the many, and contrasting how everything is within the one. and that we fail to see sometimes that the instability is also part of that one. And Mercury, being the gender defying planet, even traditionally speaking, really makes us look at that in a much more real way. Like, why is it that something that doesn't fit fits? And I think that's the question that we really have to sit with Mercury. But yeah, does that make sense?
Absolutely, that's great. Keep going.
Oh, no worries.
Oh, that's awesome.
But yeah, so thank you. But yeah, so to me, this is just the big idea, and it's this concept that allows us to look at gender in a much more broader way. And to me, this was, and I say this because to me, this was a very big part of me understanding myself as a gender not gender non-conforming, gender non-binary. All these words. As a person who identifies as he and they, it took me a long time to get to that, because for me, I first I came out as a gay man, and for me that was already like a whole process, and even within that disruption of the binary, I was still trying to stick to at least a portion of it. And this is what this is how the moon really comes back. It's that sense, or I'm stepping too far from the community, I'm stepping too far from the norm, then I need to hold on to a little piece of it so I can still fit and we can all still get along. But sometimes the effort has to go both ways for the moon, because the moon waxes and wanes. So there's the push and pull that needs to happen for that integrity to really take place. So in thinking about that and thinking about my gender and sexual identity, one of the big questions that really stuck with me is, why would I not feel like a man? What is it that um, makes what I am different than that complete end of the pole? Because if we're talking about gender, I like to conceptualize it as a spectrum. I don't think even the idea of a spectrum, I don't think necessarily um, explains it, because it really is an experience. It's a thought and it's a concept that needs to be explained from person to person, which is why I feel like it's so mercurial. It's not a thing that you can just say, oh, everyone who's this gender is like this. It's more so like, it's almost like a name. Gender can be almost like a name. So, and it was that understanding that gender can be almost like a name, and that the way that I express it doesn't have has no rules and regulations, that really changed how I um how I approached this, and how I felt, um how I got to feel comfortable with my identity, and how I got to feel comfortable with sharing it with others. And this is still an ongoing process, because we're back to the moon, and this is the thing that we're going to keep doing. It becomes really hard to accept yourself when the world is still not quite there yet. And especially when the world still hasn't come up with a word to describe what it is that you are. And despite we're having attempts of coming up with the words, it's not like it's we're quite there yet. It's not like something that is just like blue. Everyone understands what blue is, or everyone understands what an apple is. And I'm sure that the first time that somebody tried to name an apple, there was some sort of outrage. But and that's always the cycle that we go through. And this is the thing that I had on my notes that I totally forgot to tackle, because I got a little bit sidetracked. We're talking about the idea of gender and rules, and how, like, so far our understanding of gender has been very rule coded. And one of the things that Mercury is also associated is with animals that have no gender. We do have many animals that have both organs, both reproductive organs, and they can even reproduce among themselves asexually, and that's one of the material manifestations of Mercury. But one of the things that I realized too is that most animals that do that, they're invertebrates. Invertebrates, yeah. So they don't have any bones. And bones are ruled by Saturn, which rules rules.
Right. Oh, that is
So,
fascinating.
right. That blew my mind when I looked it up. I was like, whoa. So
Like
it is.
they're literally more flexible, like metaphorically and physically, they're more flexible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the things that I love about astrology, is that as much as you can look for the answers in books, sometimes you can just look out in the world and be like, oh, what are Mercury things? And put them all together and stare at them and be like, oh, this is what Mercury means. um, but yeah, so just going back to this idea of gender and rules and gender nonconformity or non-binary identities breaking away from the grasp of Saturn. It's really breaking away from authority and um, the institutions that tell you, like, you men supposed to look like this, and women are supposed to look like this. And even now there's sadly enough, even within the transgender community and the non-binary community, there's people who will also say, like, if you're a non-binary, you have to be like this, because Saturn will always make its statement. And I think that one of the things that tells us is that there will always be rules, but Mercury will always be there to break them. And even if we are in a place where non-binary identities will be accepted and be more integrated into normality, into the lunar sphere, where of the day-to-day and the routine, there will always be something trying to um, to give structure to all of that. I don't think that the structure is the problem, but it's the lack of lack of flexibility, like we're talking about with the invertebrates, to really step out of what you think the world is and what your version of the world is, to open it up to the Mercury sphere of what the world can be and all the other possibilities therein. Yeah, that was my speech on Mercury and gender.
Yeah, well, it's bringing up a question and also maybe a reflection. I don't know if the reflection, I'm debating in my head whether to reflect, but I'll ask you the question. It's making me wonder your thoughts on Mercury rules, of course, Gemini and Virgo. And I can see how all the stuff you're saying could totally apply to Gemini, much more like instinctively it fits with Gemini for me. And then I'm trying to feel into Virgo. And of course I have Virgo rising, Virgo moon on my ascendant in Virgo. So a lot of Virgo energy. And I'm just trying to feel into, so anyway, any thoughts you have on Gemini versus Virgo and the flexibility, rule defining aspects of Mercury? If you have any thoughts.
Yeah, of course. I think that like the usually, even stepping outside of gender as a whole, the way that I like to think about Mercury and Gemini and Mercury and Virgo, of course, for those who don't know, Mercury is the domicile lord, or the planet that rules or presides over Mercury and Gemini and Virgo, but Mercury is also said to be exalted in Virgo, which is its own sign. And the way that I like to think about that is that Gemini is the air sign, or the air counterpart of Mercury, is very much what we've been talking about, like the conceptual side of things, and the process of naming what it is that things are. And one of the things that, for me at least, and I guess I can use my little journey with gender to describe like the whole process, is that first it starts as a concept, and first it starts as a word that you hear and you know that it's possible. And it's almost like we're saying about the apples, like the first person that named an apple was probably outraged, is that up until there was a name for an apple, no one could ask for an apple. No one even knew that could be a thing. Maybe there was a word for fruit and you could ask for fruit and you'd get all these other options, but none of them were the specific option that you wanted. And the Gemini process was that for me, was naming the thing and knowing that the feeling that I've had has a name and it can be carried out. Now, the Virgo bit, and I think that this is why Mercury is exalted in Virgo, is that it's able to take that idea out of the idea space and bring that into Earth, into things that are concrete and physical. So now you're not just describing the idea, the ethereal thing that's out there, also bringing into embodied life, and knowing that the idea is not just an idea, it can be made real, and it has been real, and just naming it just makes it so it can be communicated more easily. And I think that for me, the whole gender issue is always about naming things, and I think that that's the thing that most people have an issue with too, is that everyone wants to name it a different thing. And that's why I really like the idea of gender almost being like a name, or like a secondary name, because it is a thing that cannot be easily explained. It's almost a word that's supposed to describe not entirely what your experience as a person is, but at least like a good chunk of it. Sorry, I lost my train of thought where I was going with that.
It's okay. I can go to the thing I'm debating whether I should share.
Yeah, of course.
You want me to, unless you can remember what you were going to say. No.
If I remember it, I'll say it.
Okay. So this is pushing my own learning edge, which is why I'm hesitating, right? But I think I will push my learning edge in service of all of our learning and healing, with the caveat that we can all be wrong, right? And we
Right.
all are learning and changing, which is the point of this whole symposium. So I'm like, I'm very sorry if I offend anybody, but anyway, just being really honest in my own process. So I think a lot about the moment we're in as a collective, like as a society, with all of this gender non-conforming rule breaking stuff, right? And it feels so healthy and healing and good to me, right? And I think about I'm 45, and so I was a teenager and a young adult, obviously, a bunch of years ago, and then now I have a 15-year-old who identifies as pansexual and gender fluid in some version, and similar to you, he's like, I don't care what pronoun you use, but it's more like he, they-ish, right? But whatever, somebody calls him she, he's like, okay, fine, whatever, I don't really care. So, and in my day, I originally would have identified as bisexual, and in my day, when I was in college, the sexual orientation stuff was huge. You know, I was part of LGBTQ groups and like leadership and blah, blah, through college and grad school. And it was a big deal. And there was certainly, I knew transgender people, but the non-binary thing wasn't a thing, like, or wasn't talked about at all.
Right.
At all. So now, even when I'm talking to people more like 40s and 50s, these days, it feels like we are all in this major uphill learning curve around gender identity. And it's like my 15-year-old is teaching me a lot, right? So for example, here's where I'm like, oh no, I hope I don't offend anybody. But again, it's my own process. This weekend, I think I was telling you before we started recording, my son was in the school play. And one of the things that I loved was that it was a musical, and there were a lot of dancing and all this stuff. Okay. So there's this one person who I was fascinated by. I loved watching them dance. And I could not figure out how this person identified gender-wise. I could not figure out like how this person would have been identified at birth either. And I saw the person after the play get into their car and like go off with a friend and all that kind of, I still couldn't figure it out. And finally, at one point I was like, I think in quote unquote my day, that person would have been like a butch lesbian. That's what we would have called them, right? And then after another time I saw them and I said, oh, your dancing was amazing. And they spoke to me and I realized, oh, no, that person would have been identified as a boy at birth. Okay. So I was like, I was totally wrong. And then I went to a bunch of the shows. And so I was watching this person dancing and I was feeling into like that, like this person summed up for me the non-binary or a version of being like, it was so complete in the way that they carry themselves and like all this stuff. And so I was just feeling into it. And it was just a fascinating, beautiful thing to be able to be in the presence of, because they're so comfortable in who they are, in a way that,
right,
again, in my generation wasn't a thing yet. Nobody was openly talking about their identity in that way. So anyway, it's just something I'm sitting with personally, and it's changing me from the inside out, and I think it's a parallel thing that's happening in our world, of course. Anyway, there's my sharing.
Yeah, no, I don't understand why you'd have been afraid of that.
Okay. Well, it's like I'm rocking this fine line. Yeah.
That is very true. But yeah. I think that is it too, because like you're saying, in your time, you would have just called the person like a butch lesbian. But then now there's a word for it.
Actually, yeah, they're not even a woman, but whatever. Yeah, like, right. Yeah. But sorry.
Yeah, no, but just the fact that there's a word for it it allows you to think of the thing that you're seeing in a different way.
Yeah.
It opens up a separate category for you
Yeah.
to sort that out in your head,
Right.
which is a very mercurial sort of process. And I think that the same way that it's easy, I guess, for non-binary people to understand the mercurial process that I was talking about, of first finding out that there is a name to the feeling they have and then concretizing it. But I think the same can happen to people who are not non-binary, but I think it's the reverse of the process. Like maybe first you see the concrete thing. Oh, not thing, because I guess we're talking about people, and that would be not appropriate. But first you see the person, and then comes the thought, like, who is this person? Like, how do I categorize them? And I think that that process can have some negative side effects, because then we can put people into too many boxes. But sometimes it can be very beneficial, because if you cannot categorize that person into anything, and that's when you can go and talk to them, which is Gemini, and just be genuinely curious and interested in who that person is and what the experience is. And that's why I always go back to almost comparing gender to that second name that I mentioned earlier, because I think a lot of people always complain, especially about like Twitter profiles that have she, her, and the person looks very female presenting and everything. And some people will be upset about that. They're like, you already look like a woman, you already look female. Why is it that you have to tell me that? And I think that it's that changing of the process that we're having, and changing of the framing of what gender is, because now so far our understanding of what gender is very much defined by body biology and the concrete, the things that you can see and touch. But then now, especially with the dawn of psychology and everything, because especially if we're talking about way back when, to Hellenistic times and Renaissance times, they didn't have that. Now that we have more of a psychological mindset, we're open to the idea of things that are not physical also being real. So I think that if we were to, I guess, compare and contrast name and gender, I guess the name is really it's the name of the physical part of the person. It's the thing that you immediately see, and you can call them by their name, and that will be the most immediate point of contact. Now, with gender, it's now describing the inner bits of that person, I guess, and the psychology and the mind, and how it works and it presents itself to the world, and how it translates into the body. Because I think that the body, like if we go back to the Chaldean order, the body is the moon, and it's the last sphere before we actually come here to Earth. So Mercury, as the title of this talk suggests, the gender defying planet, will first come up with look at the whole spectrum, look at the everything, and then find the little slice of where that person fits, and then name it. And I guess maybe that could be gender. And this is a working process for me. I by no means have all the answers, but that's how I come to understand it, and that's how I make sense of the changes that are happening, both within and without my own world. But yeah, does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. Absolutely. It brings up a question, but keep going. Do you have a next thought where you wanted to go, or
I do, but maybe your question will elaborate on it,
okay.
or add more to it.
Well, like in terms of thinking about this moment in time where we are, right? We're in, we're recording this in early May 2022. We'll be the symposium will be going in June of 2022, so another month and a half. But so at this moment, Pluto is currently at the end of Capricorn, and so when I think of the deconstructing of how we conceive of gender and sexuality and all of this, I definitely think of Pluto being at the end of Capricorn, and I think of the Saturn-Uranus square, and there's various things I think of. Not a whole lot comes up for me around Mercury Mercury or anything in Gemini or Virgo, right? And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about the overall moment we're in terms of how we are reconceiving and revisioning all of this.
Right. And this is I by no means am ready to answer this question, but there is a thought that I often have that kind of goes with it. Because as I studied with Chris Brennan, Patrick Watson, and Christopher Warnock, who are all traditional astrologers. So I still am very much learning how to work with the outer planets and trying to integrate them. So it's not every concept that I'm like super stoked yet just to implement. And one of them, no, I'm going to a specific place with this. But one of them is the concept of higher octaves, of like Mercury, of Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury.
That's what
this is the thing that I always, this is always the thing that I think about. I'm like, what does that, especially as a musician? Because for me, like an octave would mean something very specific. And I'm always not really sure if that same sort of thought works with the other planets. But with Uranus, it's one of them that to me makes really sense, makes a lot of sense for Mercury, especially when we take into considerations the Chaldean order and the sphere of the moon and the sphere of Saturn. The sphere of the moon is that last step before things are grounded and things are come into a physical and carnal existence. Saturn is the first step of that whole thing. But if we flip that and we almost think of Saturn as the moon of our traditional or visible solar system, then Uranus becomes the same thing that Mercury does to the moon, but to Saturn. So it breaks that whole process of no, you can go ahead and say what you were going to say.
I'm just saying, wow. Yes.
Oh, okay. But to me, it really does break that whole process of the mundane, but Saturn is the mundane, not in the sense of the moon, that is your day-to-day ritual and just the things that are I guess routinely and all of that. Saturn is the mundane, but the structures and the traditions that keep everything running. And then Uranus, to be the defier of Saturn, the way that Mercury defies the moon, would be to break that foundation and really, I guess, open up past just the body, I guess, but the moon, it's hard to really explain it, but we're talking about Mercury with the moon, and Mercury breaking the process of the body. But I guess with Saturn, it's not so much about one individual body, but more so the whole body of the Earth and how that's being broken down and how gender in that level is being broken down. So I would attribute, like you said, a lot of that to the Saturn-Uranus square, because then we have a very angular and pivotal moment sort of happening in relationship to those two players that we're putting into contrast. But I think that has such huge implications that we're not really ready for it yet. I think it's easy for us to understand, okay, Mercury breaking down the binary of the body. Like, I have a body, I can understand what that experience might be like. Now, if we step into a global level with Saturn and breaking down gender and not and I guess when we step into Saturn, gender becomes less of a bodily thing and more so of all of all of the binaries. Even if you're talking about like politics, the left and the right, and progressive, conservative, and all those other things, also being broken down, and all those binaries really shattering. So I think that um, there are transits and things happening in the moment that are also contributing to this, but the I don't think um our body's gender is necessarily the end goal. It's included in the mix, but I think there is much more that's being broken down. And I think that that's the big difference between speaking about Mercury, which is so mundane and moves so fast and it's on our sort of almost on our daily pace, versus something that's so large, like Saturn and Uranus.
Yeah. I love that parallel that you drew between the moon and Saturn being kind of like almost like the regular container of our self and our
Hmm.
constructs, that's super awesome. And then of course Mercury and Uranus being the energy that comes along and kind of, I think I've gotten this image lately of Saturn almost being like this gentle thing that's stacking up dominoes, in a particular order or
Right.
whatever. And then Uranus comes along and goes, and it's like, wait a minute, there's another way we can do this. So how about we just knock it all down? I mean, not necessarily.
Right.
Maybe it's working for us, but a lot of it isn't, right? And then, so then if we have Mercury kind of that has the same ability, but maybe on a quote unquote smaller level, but as a hologram, so I don't think anything is small or big, but on a closer in level, maybe Mercury has a similar sort of you thought
Right.
you thought it maybe was this way, but it doesn't need to be. And maybe there's another way we're meant to do it right now. Or,
Right.
let's get more flexible here with ourselves.
Yeah, and I think it's all part of the process. I think right now we're in a moment where we're gaining traction with that flexibility, and if we're being honest with ourselves, we're probably gonna overdo that flexibility at some point,
Mm,
and then that's when we'll turn to Saturn to course correct. And it's always the game. we we're too flexible, and then we're not flexible enough, and then we're too flexible again, and then we're not flexible enough.
mm.
So I guess it's a big lesson on finding a nice middle ground, which is kind of what we're doing, I guess.
Totally. Awesome.
um, no, you can go ahead. There was
Yep.
one
No,
thing that I wanted to say.
I was about to say what
Okay, sweet.
next on. Yeah, keep going.
I think I went pretty much through all of the points that I had saved, albeit not in the order that I wanted to go through them, because I tend to get a little haphazard. But there is something that from this linguist called Archie Crowley that I was reading their paper, and they also did speech for TED Talk, I think, maybe the Australian TED Talk, and they were talking about the evolution of language and how sometimes we tend to think of language as this fixed thing, that it's always the same and it never changes, and how even at some point, like now, it's really easy for us to say you, like I love you, I know you, and blah blah blah. But before that wasn't the case. You wouldn't have a you that's both collective and a you that's singular. Um, but now we very much use both words interchangeably. Before we had thou for singular people, and then I guess you
No,
was for
no.
multiple people. I forget.
Yeah.
I would recommend anyone to just read the paper or actually listen to to the TED Talk, because they're gonna do a better job at explaining it than me. But to me, that just made me think that we're very much in that process right now of introducing or changing what a word can mean. Um, and I think that if we try to be more mercurial in our approach to this change, um, and really approach it with more curiosity, as opposed to like the lunar way of trying to keep things the same and routinely, these things won't be so, I guess, defiant in the way that they present themselves. Sometimes I feel like a lot of people might feel like this is just like a revolution in a very Uranian way. We're just talking about Uranus, and people are just trying to um, question the status quo and really break things down. But then sometimes it really is that our language needs to evolve to be able to describe something new that hasn't been new. It just hasn't had a name for so long.
Mhm.
Um, and I think the more we're willing to step into this place of creating words and not creating words and destroying words and changing their meaning and doing what it is that we want with them, like true poets,
Ah,
um, that's when life becomes much more poetic and becomes much more flexible. So, to me, that's the lesson that everyone needs to learn about from Mercury.
mm,
Just to be a little flexible and curious, um, and be willing to step out of any category.
mhm. That's
That's
so
it.
beautiful. Yeah, it makes me think about, I mean, I have, my Mercury is in Pisces. So I have a pretty unusual, I should say, lots of people have Mercury in Pisces, so it's not unusual, but it's uh considered not necessarily like the best placement. I love it. I think it's awesome. It works really well for me. Um, but it's making me think when you talk about poetry, one thing I've known with myself just writing poetry is that sometimes I'll get in a mode where I go, oh my God, it's like for me, again, the Mercury in Pisces is like suddenly there will be this flow that just literally has to flow through me. And of course, I also channel, but that's a really different feeling for me than writing poetry. I mean, it's related. It's both the like Mercury Pisces-ish thing, but it's a very distinct feeling. The two are very different. But when I write poetry, it's certain emotions and memories and ways of like certain, I will suddenly realize I feel certain ways about something, certain things. The only way I could have realized it was if I was writing this poetry. Like the
Mm,
writing of the poetry for me takes me literally into worlds that I couldn't access without the poetry. Does that make sense? Like the poetry coming through me, not me reading the poetry, but and so when you talk about the language of even like they them, right? If I switch my mode into thinking of it as being a creative process or a flow coming even from the divine, you know, um, takes on such a different meaning. Um, like so needed. Like it doesn't need to be a logical, we have a word that says this or this, you know, it can, that's fine. And words are not only that, they have lots and lots of,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's the hard thing about thinking like Mercury, because you always have to open up the space for both things being true at the same time. Like,
Mm,
yes, we need the rational, this is the word, this is what it means. But
mhm.
also, we have to understand that the word is only a word. It is not the actual thing. It's only
Right.
its only job is to make it easy to communicate what it is that this thing is to many people to be able to understand it.
Right.
But the true essence of the thing will never really be understood. So I think that, yeah, I think that's it. I think that summarizes it.
Cool. Yeah. Well, and when I was in college and I was first studying, I was I was a psychotherapist for a long time. So I studied a lot of psychology, clinical social work, and that was like what I got trained to do a long time ago. And one of my favorite professors, who taught my very first ever abnormal psychology class, her big thing, and the big thing that never left me, this was when I was like, what, 20 or 21, so a long time ago. Um, she emphasized what she called the reification of any and all conceptions we might have about like mental health in particular, right? So
Mm,
so like reification, like the root of the word reification is rei from Latin, meaning the thing. So it's like we have these words, and we misinterpret a word for a thing. Like, just because you label it doesn't make your concept real. You know, like, so when we make up the word, let's say schizophrenia, or like whatever, normal, or whatever, that is our concept. We have labeled a concept. We have not created a thing. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, totally.
Yeah. So that, I mean, it just applies to like everything. But right, like people get really stuck, like just in terms of mental health, like people get really stuck. Oh, I have OCD or whatever. Well, okay, sure, you have these symptoms that we have as humans in this particular social cultural moment. We've like lumped these symptoms under this thing that we called, you know, obsessive compulsive disorder, but that doesn't mean that OCD actually exists. You know, it's like we made it up just so we could have something we could categorize, so we could feel more control over it, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just, we need to remember that it's like, not like you can look under a microscope and see the OCD virus or something, because there's no such thing. Right? So,
no, 100%. And even like going back to the apple example, because I think that like an apple is something that everyone would say, this is an apple. Like we didn't make up the apple. Like, yes, we did.
Yeah.
Because even the one apple that you asked for, that one apple has its own individual identity. You could name it Joe for that matter, and that apple is now Joe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that like this really shows the power that words have, but also the power that words sometimes can lack. Because like you said, a word will never create anything. It's only naming what's already there. But it's only making it so multiple people can understand that this thing is here. Like it's a way to share experiences with one another without actually having to experience the thing. Like your example with OCD. Like you might not have OCD, but when you say the word OCD, now you have all these different things that you can think of and put together in your mind, so you can at least understand it as close as you can. But again, we'll never be able to truly understand it because the word is only summarizing it. It's never actually expressing the reality that is. And that could get me on a whole tangent with Mercury and the sun, but I don't think we need to go there.
Well, I'm thinking of one last question I have, if you want me to ask.
Of course.
Yeah, and you can pass on this question because it's kind of a personal question. But so I'm thinking of people listening, and the intention of this symposium, which is, you know, the title is Rebecoming the One, and the purpose of it, of course, is healing our relationship to gender and sexuality, etc. So when I feel into this movement of recognizing the non-binary of gender, again, like I said earlier, it feels really healing, like really good, like a really good process, and actually a good reflection, I think, maybe even of where our world is, even though our world looks like it utterly sucks, to be totally blunt, right? And I'll go on a slight tangent and explain a little more of why I say that. Because, for example, my son, right, like my 15-year-old, I talked to him I don't know, a few months ago about his own gender identity, and I was just kind of asking him certain questions about, why do you think, you know, your generation, this is coming up so clearly in your generation and it didn't in mine, even though I'm super pro the gay rights and blah blah blah, and very involved in the LGBT community and all this stuff, right? But it from my generation, it wasn't a thing yet, wasn't talked about. And his reflection, which blew me away, which I don't know how, you know, how generalized it could be. It's definitely his experience, but I don't know if it's true for anybody else. He said, well, I think for your generation and generations before you, your sense of the feminine and the masculine were at odds with each other. Like we're at war in a certain way. And for me, growing up, I didn't see that, which shocked me because his dad and I are divorced. It's not like we like fought like horribly in front of him or anything like that, but we're not together. And so if he has a mother and a father and they're not together, I would think like he has some internalized sense of the feminine and masculine having some kind of conflict, but he says that he doesn't, right? And so that was really fascinating to me. And that could be a whole other conversation of like, where did that come from? I have no idea. But but it was really cool that I don't think he's the only one, probably of his generation, that like the sense of the quote unquote genders being less and less and less at odds seems to be a sort of seeping through somewhere, even though again in the bigger world I would say it's like exploding. It's not good. Right, I don't know if you have any reflection just on that part. I got off on a tangent.
Yeah. No. 100%. I think there's also another piece of to that we talked about earlier when we were talking about like the Gemini and Virgo process, especially for people who are not non-binary and are trying to understand it. I think that one thing that my generation and your child's generation has in common is the internet. And the internet as a space that allows you to see so many things, it really steps into that like concrete Virgo, like this is a thing that exists. And then we go towards the Gemini thing, like how do we name that? And because the internet is already such a mercurial space where if you just type up how do we name that, thousands and thousands of people will come and name it. It becomes so much more easy for, especially for a developing brain, to just be like, this is a word that describes this experience. I understand it. Now, I was talking to my friend the other day, and it was about something completely unrelated. I think it was like trading. Yeah, because we're talking about Bitcoin, I think. And he was trying to explain Bitcoin to his parents, and his parents just couldn't understand it. And one thing that really made me realize is that the whole thing with generations is that your brain has grown into the world, into this one world, and that's your own world. But the world itself has also its own growth cycle, that you might stay within the one world that you were born into, but the world will continue to live on and do different things, almost like it's not almost like it is its own entity. It is its own entity. And I think that one of the things that this does is that if the world not evolves, because I think that sometimes that can make it seem like one thing is better than the other. But if the world moves past a certain threshold where it's above your world, there's just nothing in the world that can open up your world to the world at large. And I think that's why it's sometimes for people of older generations, it might be really, really hard to understand it, because the world that you were born into, that word didn't exist. That concept was just like not there. So for it to now be a thing, it feels like it's not real because you're still living within your own world. And it's real to the new world. And that's the going back to the whole Mercury thing. Both of them can be true. Both worlds can live within one another. But it's only when, I guess, if we keep going up the tree of life in the Chaldean order, the next thing is Venus. That really brings the unifying thing, that unites both of these worlds together. It's only through that compassion and through that love for one another that we can really open the doors of your world, my world, and the world at large, and see that all these worlds really are just one. And all of these things that exist and don't exist yet are all real. And even the things that are like the spiritual realm and the physical realm, they're all real. The realm of thought and the realm of tangibility is also real. And I guess now we're talking about Venus, but Venus is the planet that really comes to unify all of that and make those sorts of things possible. To take the contradictions that Mercury instills and make them able to coexist with one another while still contradicting one another. But
yeah,
I hope that answers the question.
And Venus also being so much about listening, like truly
Mhm.
hearing you, and you truly hearing me, and sharing from the heart in that way that we feel like we know we're being heard. Yeah, that's amazing.
Right. And it's even funny how the Mercury signs always are followed or come before a Venus sign.
Oh wow, you're kind of like you're stretching my mind in many ways here. But is it okay if I bring it back to the? I went off on a tangent
Of course.
in the middle of a point. I just want to bring it back
you're
to
all
the
good.
original. Okay. So yeah, so what I was originally going to go to is, when I'm sitting with this non-binary reality, what I feel in myself is a very healing experience. And I can say, even when my son came out to me like a year ago or something, pansexual and gender fluid, some virgin, right? When he said all that, I was like, oh yeah, okay, sure. And on the one hand, like especially the pansexual stuff, it's how I identify in terms of sexual orientation. So I was like, well, me too. And he's like, wait, really? And I was like, how do you not know that? Anyway, yes. but something about him coming out as gender non-conforming, I literally, like in the hour or two after, like just that evening, my whole body relaxed. Like there was some major shift in my body, literally, that was like my whole body took this deep sigh of relief, and had nothing to do with him. It was about me, my own concept of myself. It was like some really significant, really profound thing about having my own child come out to me in that way suddenly gave my body permission to be whatever I am. I don't quite know why. Like, why does it need to be my child who suddenly has that effect? But it did. And I identify mainly as cisgender female, but I would say whatever, like she, they ish, whatever. But anyway, so for me, this non-binary reality just feels so relieving. Like we can just be who we are, right? So I'm curious for you, if you have anything you want to share or not share, is totally fine, because it's a very personal question. What does the experience of feeling into the gender non-binary, regardless of, you happen to realize that you do identify somewhere in the non-binary something, but I think even for maybe people who don't, I think there's a potential for healing just in recognizing the reality of it. Anyways, any thoughts you have? I would love.
Oh, absolutely. I agree so much. Just because it opens up, because I think the binary is so tiring because these are two, like we talked at the very beginning, these are two archetypes. Femininity and masculinity are two archetypes that we can never live up to. And that whole process of really trying to stick to, okay, I'm a man, then I have to be the most man thing that has ever manned in life is so tiring. And I think that to open up the world for non-binary identities to comfortably exist, I think there is also a part of you, even if you don't identify as a non-binary, that can take that sigh of relief, that you understand that those two ends of the spectrum, they're just ends of the spectrum, that very few people, if not none, no people can ever really represent. So I think that it just, I think that allowing for non-binary identities to step into that lunar sphere that we were talking about, the mundane and the ordinary, allows for the fluidity of human bodies and the human experience to really be um, more present in the human psyche. Like it's more, it becomes much easier for people to understand that they can just be themselves and that's enough. You don't have to really fight to be this one thing or this other thing, because at the end of the days, those are just archetypes and they're not not real. They're very much real, but they're not human. And humans are very diverse. And archetypes are not. They're very much fixed. And I think we need to embrace a little bit more of our diversity within and without, because it's one thing to accept everyone for who they are, but it's much harder to accept yourself for whoever you are. And just
Oh,
opening up the space for things to not be to not be binary, even going beyond gender, even just going with good or bad, and realizing that you're both at the same time, or even like silly internet memes about introverted and extroverted people, and seeing how really most people are somewhere in the middle. And all of these silly binaries that we've created, once we just let life present itself and on its own terms, when we let people present themselves on their own terms, we can really understand them. And in that process, we also really get to understand ourselves. Because at the end of the day, we're all just reflecting one another.
yeah. Well, and I love what you just said, that it's, I can't remember your exact word, but basically that it's easy to accept others for whoever they are, but it's a lot harder to accept ourselves for all of who we are. That's, yeah, so true. Mm.
It's not an easy process. It will probably take a lifetime, but it can be done.
Mm-hmm. It feels like we're on a good track, though, in
I think so too.
in certain ways. Yes. Awesome.
Nice.
Any other last thoughts?
I don't know. Just love yourself, love people. Think it, be Mercury. Sometimes it's nice to be flexible, and not, even if just for a day, I guess. If
Mm.
you were to just try for one day to get rid of every binary in your life and see how that feels like,
Oh
how
my God.
hard that will be, and also just what that will make the world feel like to you. I think it's such a great experience.
Yeah. Almost like the non-binary as a dose of medicine in a certain sense. Like,
Right. Because for me, like in my whole gender journey, because before I became an astrologer, I was actually very skeptical of astrology and of the spiritual world as a whole, because I grew up in a Catholic family. So my first instinct was religion and spirituality is bad, and none of that is for me. But when I accepted my non-binary self, it also opened up the room for me to accept the world as physical and not physical at the same time. So even if it's just to do that, even if the whole gender thing is not for you, which I understand for a lot of people, it is a conversation that they don't want to have. If anything you can take out of this is that understanding gender is not just understanding the gender of bodies. It's really just it's really understanding unity. And yeah. I
there,
guess that really just says it.
there, that. Can you say that sentence one more time? Because it's like, that's like highlight.
I don't even know what the sentence
What
was,
did
and then
you
it just came. I think I said understanding non-binary identities, or the non-binary. Yeah, I guess it was understanding non-binary identities. It's not really just about understanding gender of the body, but understanding unity as a whole. I think
Yes,
that's what I said.
it was something like
Need that
that.
on a shirt.
Yeah. That was so awesome.
Nice.
So what how can people find you? What do you offer in the world? What would you like people to know about you, and any way to connect with you?
Yeah. So my website is themercuryrising.com, and people can find me there. As of now, my website is down because I'm working on rebuilding it and changing my services around. I am still taking readings and consultations, but you gotta email me for that, and I'm kind of just doing it word of mouth. Um, just in the meanwhile, just as I get my website situated, because as we mentioned earlier, I'm also an artist, and a big part of my practice is talisman making, and I really want to kick that up a notch and really start being Joji, the astrological magician who makes talismans. And that whole
Awesome.
thing is really hard to get right because most spiritual people are not business people, and I am definitely the spiritual person who is not a business person. So I'm trying to get everything situated. But if you have any inquiries, if you go to my website, there is a contact form and you can fill it and get in contact with me. And also, you can find me on my Twitter page. That's where I'm most active. It's at Astro Boy with an I, Joe G. But yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit about the talisman thing? Because I'm curious. I'm curious, personally curious what to hear it. Do you want to give
Yeah.
a yeah? What is
Yeah,
that?
so I largely follow Christopher Warnock's talisman school, I guess, school of thought. Because I studied Renaissance astrology with him. He gave me most of my primary sources, so I try to stick to his process when it comes to tangible talismans. But one of the things that I try to experiment with also is bringing multimedia um, art into this, because a lot of the traditional sources, they'll talk about using metal and using all sorts of different things, but there but now we have all sorts of materials that didn't exist back then. And a big part of my research and my interest in astrology is trying to figure out what can we do with technology to make these talismans. And even one big experiment that I did recently for the astrology hub where I work at was making a musical talisman and turning a whole music video into a talisman and grabbing the voices of a couple hundred people and putting together into this piece. And the results were definitely amazing. So it's definitely
Oh,
something that I want to keep doing. But that is my own passion project slash research project to see if it is possible to make talismans out of immaterial things. And I think it most certainly is.
what is the basic definition of a talisman?
So it's kind of hard to explain it. I guess the explaining the process of what a talisman ritual is better,
Okay.
because the basic intention is to give birth to a thing, but you're also asking for particular spirits to in-house the thing that you're giving birth to, and most of the times those can be pictures, jewelry, and all sorts of things, and you make it under a specific timing, um, and like almost like you're deliberately picking the birth chart of the given thing, and you're making sure that the particular spirit or planet is strong or um, prominent in the chart, so it can make it easier for the thing to ensoul the physical object. The challenge that I come with making things out of technology and virtual devices is that you're not really ensouling a physical object. But I don't think a soul is physical, so I don't think it really matters all that much if you're ensouling a sound. Definitely different effects, I would say, but I think both of them are possible. And my larger my long-term inquiry is really what the difference is, because the way that I like to conceptualize it is talisman making by making jewelries and pictures and frames and statues is more in the realm of earth, and making magic or using magic in an earthly context. But now taking it towards technology and music and all those things, we're really working more along the lines with air, and how does an air element talisman work, and what are the benefits of using air versus using earth, and so on and so forth. But I'm very much a baby in this research. It will take me tons and tons of time, but that's what I'm all about.
So cool. And it's like everything is vibration, everything is energy, you know. So I would think, like, if you happen to have something made out of something tangible, three-dimensional, whatever, that's a certain version of vibration, but sound is also vibration, of course. And so
Right.
yeah, very,
Yeah.
very
And this could be like a whole other talk on its own.
I know, exactly. Yeah. No,
I'm
I can
trying to
imagine.
keep myself from talking.
No, I can imagine people getting to this and being like, wait, say a little more about that, please. So I just want to hear a little bit about it. But
Yeah,
anyway,
well, if they want to know more, my website is right there. Just send me an email.
yeah.
I'm more than happy to ramble about music and astrology for hours.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. And
Of course.
I appreciate so much how, you know, you come with this, your presence is so loving and so genuine
Oh,
and
thank you.
authentic, and like, I just really enjoy talking with you and being with you, and really, really, really
Oh,
appreciate you being a part of this so
of
much.
course. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was great coming here. I felt largely unprepared, but it went so well.
No, I love it.
Couldn't ask for better.
Yeah. And you know, I would love you to connect with Ari Moshe Wolf if you haven't already. He's, you know,
I have not, but I
oh,
would love to.
you should. He's my main astrology teacher, and he did a talk on Saturn in the symposium, but I'm gonna send him your talk and say, listen up, because this is awesome. You're gonna love it.
Oh, nice. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Now I'm nervous again.
No. So cool.
Oh,
Yeah. Thank you so much.
of course.
Mhm.